My name is Jake Eckholm. As was mentioned, I'm the Director of Development Services here with the City of Muskegon. The Development Services Division includes the Planning Department, Economic Development Department, and Community and Neighborhood Services Department. In addition to me being here and at the tables this evening, all of those department head level staff will be here to assist in collecting and or answering your questions after the presentation. This presentation is pretty dense. I'm going to try to get in through it in 30 minutes flat, but we tried to approach this as though none of you have heard of any of these projects before, and none of you have been to any of these previous public meetings. So we're going to try to start basically 1940s industrial era, kind of walk through historic uses and up to now. So really what we're trying to show is historically these sites have been private, even Hartshorn Marina prior to its becoming a municipal marina. They've been private, industrial, and now they're blighted and or vacant. We want to figure out how we can generate private investment that turns a public return. So that's really what we're trying to accomplish through the Development Services Division. So we'll have four main overview points: historical uses, and there will be several subsections; existing conditions of all three of these sites; proposed impacts to public areas, so that would include how we're generating various tax incentives through our Brownfield to help offset public investments into these sites; changes to the existing lake access, so how these private projects would impact the public access that exists today; and then also impacts to the Lakeshore Trail. Finally, we will discuss conditions post-redevelopment, so we'll take a look at what these projects will create for the public once completed and how these three sites will really interact with each other once all these projects come to fruition. So we'll start with historical uses. So, and it might lag a little bit. This is a pretty big presentation. Industrial operations. So historically, many of you probably know, I was born and raised here and still learned a lot while compiling this presentation. So West Michigan Steel and Foundry, Anaconda Wire and Cable, and Hartshorn Spring Roller Company. As of 1940, all three of these were there and operating, a couple of them before that. These are actually fire insurance maps from Sanborn Fire Insurance, Muskegon local Sanborn Fire Insurance. So they actually show the relative locations of all these things. So just to orient you, the top of the map is effectively more or less where the Adelaide Pointe Basin is, and if you continued up that way, that would be where the small boat basin is. And then to continue, we'll actually move on to the Hartshorn site. So all these structures here were the Hartshorn Company structures, and then all that area before had buildings on it at one point or was lay-down space for the rail spur, and then you can actually see where the lake is and the small boat basin is relative to today. So if you orient yourself a bit, that's where those industrial buildings were located previously. And then one more, I wanted to show this for context. So that large piece of the lake is effectively where the large boat basin is at Hartshorn Marina today. These rail spurs that you see on the map are now the location of the Boys and Girls Club, former YMCA building, just to kind of give you some context. So it's a heavily industrialized area. As of 1941, an aerial photo shows quite a bit of dumping of foundry slag. So these peninsulas were effectively created through first sawmill dumping and then continued to fill the basins in with foundry fill. So if you look closely, you can actually see these round areas. That's where actually they're dumping truckloads of foundry sand and foundry fill all the way along this lakefront. And so you can actually see what will become the Adelaide Pointe Basin, the small boat basin, the mooring field for sailboats, and then eventually the large boat basin. So lost approximately 40% of the waterfront and public water area that was there between 1940 and 1980. So fast forward to the 1950s, and Hartshorn Roller Company is relocating to Indiana, and the city acquires what is now the Hartshorn Marina site, effectively sealed the deal in 1955, initially installed the two marina lagoons with simple gravel drives, gravel parking lots, and very simple sheet pile break walls. Really designed for boats that were under 20 feet, wasn't what it is today. And then by 1960, 5 years later, they constructed what is still the marina office. So, and then later we expand and commence some commercial leasing in various forms. So these are some really interesting photos. We actually found these on slides, so thanks to the planning department for finding these and figuring out how to develop them, because if I had to do it, you wouldn't be seeing them. So you have the original Hartshorn site after removal of the structure. You can see West Michigan Steel, Westran in the background. This area to the top right is the small boat basin and the pilings that were being driven in to kind of stabilize all that foundry fill and compact all that foundry fill. This is the opening summer that the launch was first finished for the simple launch. You can see mostly small runabout boats. And then in 1960, the current office was dedicated by the mayor and city commission of that time. And then as we kind of move through the 60s and 70s and early 80s, what we now know as the large boat basin, the horseshoe basin, was installed. What you see in these top two pictures is sort of the first go-round of it. It featured 20-foot docks that were not up to today's standards as far as width, and then later on, in the later 60s, 70s, they filled in the concrete walkway with the sheet pile and the asphalt driveway. So you can kind of see something more similar to what it looks like today, though these docks were later replaced with 30-foot docks. Those are 20-foot docks. So during all that time, in 1986, Westran closes their operation and relocates the remaining assets. The Hartshorn factories are mostly down, but the Hartshorn building remains. This is looking down Franklin at what is now Fricano's. And you have just industrial disinvestment left and right, companies that are closing and moving. There's already several vacant buildings at this time. This is in the mid-80s. And so Stan Whitaker of Whitaker Electric, a local company here, purchased this and submitted plans to the city for a $5 million remodel into the Lumbertown development, which featured a concept for a marine motel, so a motel that was geared towards recreational boaters, a restaurant, which did come to fruition, and some retail spaces, which did come to fruition. In addition to that, there's a lot more Hartshorn building at this point than what exists today. So in 1986, Mr. Whitaker actually worked a deal with the city where he developed a lease that was approved by the city commission to use the rear portion of this building for in-out storage. And so that's where those existing forklift drops came from, because we never actually did municipal forklift drops at this site. So through some research, we discovered that's actually the Lumbertown development that installed those. And you can see actually there were shopper docks there at the time provided by Lumbertown, because it was designed for boaters to be able to get off and go to the restaurant, go do the retail shopping, things of that nature. So the rear of what is now that big parking lot behind Fricano's actually had a steel building there that utilized rack storage, which is effectively like a boat vending machine. They put them on racks and blocks and use forklifts to get them up and down, and then would go out to that forklift drop and put boats in. So that's where those forklift drops originated, though they've never been a municipal operation. So that was the path that they took from the 1980s into the early 90s. So just to reiterate, we go from this heavily industrialized area, a lot of active polluting going on pre-regulation at that time, heavy railroad transfer area, into, by 1990, which is when this area was taken, much more marina-centric with a lot of slow industrial disinvestment taking place around it. So naturally, because of that, through the 1990s and into the mid-2000s, the city really focused heavily, and the community supported a lot of blight removal through this area. A lot of that has taken place just recently in the last 10 years. So demolition of vacant buildings was a key problem. We had a lot of dumping issues, a lot of trespass issues. We had some arsons through there through the years. Removal of defunct impervious surfaces, so driveways, parking lots, double-sized sidewalks, lay-down space that was concrete for the railroad. All that stuff over time was broken up and removed. And then obviously a huge achievement that was not done by the city, but really led by the Muskegon Lake Watershed Partnership and the West Michigan Shoreline Redevelopment Commission. That's a long name, got that right. The rest of the thing will go fine because I got that right. So they really spearheaded Muskegon Lake cleanup. Because of all this industrial pollution over years, obviously Muskegon Lake was a federal area of concern. That's been well covered in the media, and that was a huge focus of the 90s into the 2000s. So you can see these are some of the structures. Some of you may remember them. I actually remember a few of these as well. Right along Western Avenue, 2014, a portion of what is now on the Adelaide Pointe property was former Westran, was demolished. These are former storage areas. You can see in this top right corner a lot of dumping, a lot of people dumping mattresses, construction materials, things of that nature. And then on the other side of Western, you had Anaconda Wire. So you can see there that that was removed. I believe that was removed in 16. So from there, we have all these vacant spaces. And last but not least, this was a former industrial parking lot for staff. City ended up coming to own it, and in 2017 we removed the concrete and backfilled this and seeded it. So removing those impervious surfaces that were unsightly and didn't serve a purpose. So, and then obviously for the Muskegon Lake cleanup, I want to give huge kudos to the MLWP and the West Shoreline Redevelopment Commission. So this map in the top right, anything in orange illustrates contaminated sediment remediation on the lake bottom. Anything in green is emergent water habitat that was restored by those two entities. In the top right, that's actually a project that was completed at Rotary Park and Heritage Landing in that area. And then these are examples of native species native to Michigan inland lakes that are infilled during those types of remediations. So, what we get today, after 1940s industrialization, 1990s sort of vacant and blight cleanup, we get to contemporary lower western, which largely is vacant. We still have a lot of, impervious surfaces that are in the process of getting either rehabbed or removed, and then a lot of just vacant land that's historically disused and disinvested, and in some cases contaminated. So that moves us into existing conditions. So what does this look like today? So we really are talking today about three sites. We're talking about the Hartshorn Marina, our public municipal marina park, which is a charter park. We're talking about Hartshorn Village, which is a residential condominium complex. And then we're talking about Adelaide Pointe, which is a mixed-use redevelopment site. So first, we're going to start with status of Hartshorn Marina. If you haven't had experience at the marina, you may not know that over the last several years, I'm sure it was covered in the news, that statewide we had severe high water. There were state resources actually allocated to help repair a lot of things that were destroyed. The most prominent thing here in Muskegon was actually at Cruzy Park with the boardwalk steps getting destroyed by the Lake Michigan high water. But we suffered greatly at Hartshorn Marina and other sites along Muskegon Lake as well. So I've circled in blue various areas. So the small boat basin is at your top left. That completely flooded out with shin-deep water. The two sides of the peninsula met in the middle, and it was completely submerged in some areas. The trailer parking right here and the large boat basin corner where the pavilion was is on the right. This was the boat launch itself, which we had to close in 2020, and it remains closed now. And then that middle, lower left, that middle section there is actually the Lakeshore Trail. That section of the trail always had some water issues, but when this happened, it flooded badly. So, and then another one that I actually personally took in April of 2020, that's the small boat basin, and that is completely submerged about 40 yards back, and then about another 20 yards out into the parking lot. So we had pretty severe flooding, which really hastened the degradation of the already aged docks that we had in some of those areas, the small boat basin and the T-dock particularly. So we'll do I want to move back really quickly. So just to kind of list through those issues at Hartshorn, again, we have pavement surfaces that have been deferred maintenance issues. There's lots of cracking, potholes, issues like that at Hartshorn Marina that need to be addressed. I mentioned the aging and damaged docks. That high water absolutely accelerated that damage. We did remove the T-dock, and at the table that references impacts to Hartshorn Marina, we have a study completed by Abonmarsh in 2020 to 21, I believe it was, where we intended to replace that T-dock with a new T-dock, and it came back approximately twice what we estimated from cost quotes due to commodity issues. So that T-dock remains out today. And then the East Peninsula, those docks, actually in this picture, that I'll forward to again, you can actually, if you look carefully, you can see a piece of the dockage from one of the slips floating around in there. So it was not operational at that point. So with that, we want to move into overview of these new developments. So a lot of people have heard about these developments on the news, through MLive, through social media. Maybe you've been to one or two of our public meetings regarding these. So really, Hartshorn Village Condominium, which was first contemplated in 2018 and then ratified in 2019. And then Adelaide Pointe, which was first contemplated in late 20, early 21, and first approved at the Planning Commission level in September of 2021. So I'll quickly run through these details just for those who may not be familiar. Hartshorn Village is a residential single-family condo development. The original site plan called for 55 single-family units done over 4 phases. Construction, now it features construction of a rack boat storage facility. That was not the original intent, but it has moved in that direction over time. One of the key features of this was the management rights to Hartshorn Marina were assignable in this agreement to the condo association, so Harbor West at the time, from Public Works, who had historically managed the marina. So relocation of the bike path closer to the lakefront and elimination and rerouting of the driveway that went to the boat launch from the Hartshorn Marina office. And then elevation of the bike path in that wetland area that we showed on previous slides that was badly flooded. So that's another core component to this, was elevating that bike path so without disturbing the wetlands. And then construction of a new marina office, community building, and pool in the final phase. So I'm going to walk quickly through these site plans. I put in red right there. This is not the current site plan. So I want to make sure that this is the original that was approved in 2019 by the Planning Commission and City Commission, the original planned unit development, or PUD. PUDs are for larger parcels of property, so you see a lot of industrial redevelopment done as a PUD. If it's not going to have another big industrial building on it, it's going to be pieced up into different phases and different components. So very common planning tool for large parcels that need redevelopment. So PUD stands for Planned Unit Development, if we reference that again. So phase one is green. There's 2 of those structures completed right now, and a pad poured for the 3rd. The lighter yellow is phase 2. Phase 3 was the orange site, which was really just additional parking and landscaping space. And then phase 4 was the last round of condominiums and then the reconstructed office and pool. So that was the original iteration. So in March of 2022, we had heard from the developer at the time, which was Smith Equities and DeHaan Home Builders, and they came back with a wetland delineation study that illustrated that because of that high water likely, the wetland area in that middle section right behind Fricano's was far more extensive than what they originally contemplated in their site plan. And so because of that, as opposed to building multiple single-family condos that would have required mitigation of that impact of that wetland, they contemplated building a 16-unit single or multi-family condo building instead. So condensing it, taking up less of that wetland space, and leaving those wetlands untouched there in the middle. So that was the main change right here in this amendment. And then obviously we have a specific table that's just set up for these various developments and their site plans in the back. So after the presentation, our planning director will be out there to take any questions. And then this is the amendment that's proposed. It's actually January of 2023, Hartshorn Village proposed amendment, which was passed with conditions by the Planning Commission and is going to the City Commission on February 14th. So the main change here is it actually eliminates some of those single-family units just because they can't contemplate when they're going to be able to build those based on the housing market right now. So they want to finish out this phase and then installs that commercial building there as opposed to residential, which would be a rack storage building, which would utilize those Lumbertown era forklift drops. So that's the biggest change from the original site plan idea to the current idea. So moving on quickly to Adelaide Pointe. Adelaide Pointe is 300 plus housing unit multifamily condos over multiple phases. It also features a potential site plan for a hotel, multi-use building that would include restaurant and event space, extension of the public trail system onto the private peninsulas there, construction of new marinas and new marina, and then also a breakwall and fishing pier that's accessible to the public, relocation of the Lakeshore Trail closer to the waterfront from where it sits today, and then some more pedestrian crossings than it has today, and then conversion of the Hartshorn small boat basin into a park area, and then shopper and transient docks. So this is the original rendered site plan from September of 2021. As you can see, it features a lot of the items that I just listed. One of the biggest changes going from this one, and you'll notice these get a lot more engineering looking. So the first change that was contemplated was in June of last year, and it was mostly to include some changes to the road structure. So for traffic calming purposes, they wanted to install an additional public street here and then make the loop one-way with angled parking as opposed to two-way with parallel parking. And then they also, instead of having one restaurant building up in the top corner, they would have a restaurant and event building and then an additional boater services building for the marina, instead of having all those services in one site. So those are the main changes from the original to the June 2022 amendment. So in January of 2023, this is the proposed site plan that also goes to the City Commission. On February 14th, it was passed by the Planning Commission. The biggest change you'll notice between these two is that the marina is roughly 100 slips smaller and does not use a limestone pile breakwall, uses a wood and sheet pile breakwall, which is publicly accessible and includes that fishing pier as referenced, but it is a smaller marina. This owner acquired last year the Hartshorn Village development. So these are now both owned by one owner through two separate ownership entities. So the reason that these are so interconnected is because they are next door to each other, and now they're owned by the same person, but they are still separate developments from a planning standpoint. So I want to make sure I clarify that. So this marina has shrunk quite a bit, and then I think the other biggest change is this originally was multiple smaller buildings, smaller commercial buildings. It's now contemplated to be one larger commercial building. So as we move through that, we want to look at the overview of our existing public amenities. So what are people enjoying at Hartshorn Marina right now? What are people mostly using the park for? Want to run through that. So fishing and leisure, and then our Lakeshore Trail as well. So on this map, we want to kind of illustrate where people are primarily fishing from our observations in the fishing seasons at Hartshorn Marina Park. Visitors with mobility issues, we've noticed, tend to park at the forklift drop that we've referenced because it's all concrete and 0 grade, so people can pull right up to the water, get out of their car, pop a chair out, and fish. So in red is where you see that at the forklift drop area and the trailer parking area. And then in purple, that's actually a grassy area where a lot of people shore fish as well. That was badly damaged during that high water and now has a pretty significant slope and actually sits subgrade to the breakwall in some areas. So I've noticed less fishing over there. Not no fishing, but a lot less fishing. It's just not as comfortable an area. And then some community members also drive down to the end of the gravel drive near the small boat basin, park right there, and walk down to the small boat basin and fish in that area as well. Bring chairs and sit and fish in that area. So that map's sort of an illustration of the areas where we notice the most public fishing going on at Hartshorn Marina Park. So the current location of the Lakeshore Trail, this is actually a site as it heads into the Adelaide Pointe site. So this is an 11.2 mile trail for those of you that haven't had the opportunity to enjoy it. It runs through the marina and then also through these private development areas in the NIMS neighborhood. It's the only, the marina is actually the only public access to the trail in the entire NIMS neighborhood. Other than that, people tend to, quite frankly, trespass. They walk through for condos, they walk through the private property at the end of West Western to access that trail. What we've also noticed is that people that do go to the marina to utilize the trail, they tend to park in areas that are not intended for passenger cars. Since the marina's boat launch has been closed, this hasn't been as big of a problem because people aren't parking boat trailers there like they were. But people are parking in the loop where the boat trailers are intended to turn around. They're parking in the trailer parking, which it means you could fit kind of 2 or 3 cars in that spot. So we've noticed that there's some parking issues out there where folks that are they're really just trying to access the trail. There's just not adequate parking for them there right now. Or they're parking on private property, either in the Furcanos lot or somewhere else. This trail was developed from proceeds from the city selling what is now Chase Hammond Golf Course, and utilizing that and working with the Michigan DNR Trust Fund, going through a conversion process, installing the trail in pieces from 1995 all the way up until 2005 when it was finally pieced all together. And then, obviously, as most people know, the trail connects Pere Marquette Park at the beach all the way through to North Muskegon. And from North Muskegon, you can access the Berry Junction Trail, and then from there, the Hart Montague Trail. So it's an extremely interconnected trail system. Important non-motorized corridor. So from there, this is something that I think is important that people recognize. So there's multiple parcels at play here. The blue lines indicate parcel lines, and the one thing I really want people to take away is we often hear people describe that trail as an easement. That trail is not an easement. An easement is something that property owners grant to municipalities or is taken from property owners by municipalities for access to essential services like utilities, roads, sidewalks. This is actually a fee simple strip of property. So the proceeds that were taken from that golf course sale were used to purchase property all through every piece of private land that it touches. And so this is, as you can see, actually a long strip of parcel that runs through all these areas, and it's a piece of owned property. One thing I want to note, that the only section of it that is now easement oriented is in this area of land that was conveyed for Hartshorn Village. So when this parcel was conveyed, it included that section of trail because it had to get moved up here to what is now the bike trail and not a road. So that's the only area that's easement oriented or not fee simple property owned by the city. The rest of the entirety of the trail is fee simple property. Proposed impacts to public areas. This is another one of our major sections we want to cover. So really, we're proposing all of these changes. We're proposing all of this new residential and all of these active reuses of these former industrial sites. What is that going to do to the public space that people are utilizing right now? So first and foremost, we want to kind of cover how we're going through this and how we're implementing these agreements with various private side partners. And primarily what we're using is Brownfield tax increment financing. So Adelaide, Pointe, and Hartshorn Village both have utilities and site work that are eligible for reimbursement through tax capture, and I'll get into that process briefly. And then the city plans, pending approved agreements, to participate in the installation of some public infrastructure. So everybody hears brownfield. I don't think I know anybody who hasn't at least heard the term brownfield before, but when you hear brownfield, most people think of like dirty kind of, industrial buildings and like these big city kind of gross industrial parks. That's actually a pretty limited view. So these can be used for a lot of different things. We actually use the brownfield TIF for our infill housing program here in the city of Muskegon. So Michigan has a law that utilizes some federal allowances from the federal law for brownfields, and this allows reimbursement of eligible activities. So what that means is, as you build a new building on this site and it creates new taxable value, we take the taxes collected from the owner from various millages. So not just our city taxes, but the county taxes, college taxes, library, all special millage except for school debt and school operating, and then state taxes. So all those local taxes that are not schools, and then we keep that money until we reimburse ourselves or a developer's eligible activities until they're made whole. And what that's designed to do is take these properties that otherwise would never cash flow, nobody could ever redevelop them and make a profit, and so they sit vacant, they sit blighted. And so this helps close that gap. It's a tax incentive, and so that's effectively what we do with it. The great part about it is that it's extremely locally controllable, as opposed to other tax incentives that require going through processes driven out by state statute and state tax commission. It's actually a citizen board of Muskegon residents, our Brownfield Authority Board and DDA, that gets to decide yay or nay on these brownfield amendments. So TIF, or tax increment financing, or TIF, allows taxable value of new construction to refund investors and the city for our eligible expenditures on these sites. So, city participation in infrastructure. So, as most of us know, the roads and things down in this area are either non-existent or defunct. That requires new public streets, new public water, new public sewer. The city plans, pending approved agreements, and in some cases has already reimbursed developers at Hartshorn Village for existing roads, to put in pretty extensive public infrastructure. This is an example of waterfront public infrastructure that was done through a brownfield project in another community. Replacement of that former industrial tax base with more environmentally and economically sustainable projects. New tax base created will pay the city bonds for roads, water, sewer, and that public break wall and fishing pier, which would be added to our trail network as a city asset. And then guarantees that all common areas remain public. So just to be clear so everybody understands, effectively at Hartshorn Village, you may have already noticed there's a road and water and utilities there for this neighborhood. And so the city has reimbursed those developers and is now the beneficiary of that brownfield TIF. So as the taxes come in from these properties, we collect that to pay ourselves back for those utilities. And we contemplate doing the same thing here. So the city would bond up front for roads, water, sewer, and then that break wall in exchange for construction of the first phase of assets here, which would generate tax capture, which would pay the bond payment and the developer's eligible activities on their side of the development. And again, that's Adelaide, Pointe, and Hartshorn Village are now both owned by Ryan and Emily Leestema, and Leestema Management is the managing entity. So, changes to existing lake access. So I want to go over forklift drops, trailer parking, and the gravel drive, and how these things that exist today could change in the event these things move forward. So I'm not going to read this verbatim, but it's commercial use of forklift drops. So currently there's boats stored at the Adelaide Pointe site in those buildings that have been stored there approximately since 2005. There's been seasonal and active storage there. Hartshorn Village's PUD amendment that goes to the City Commission on February 14th includes that new rack storage building that was in orange in a previous map. Launching would shift over to that previous Lumbertown development forklift drop coming out of that building and would stop crossing the trail and going through the Adelaide Pointe property in that launch that exists on the trail today. The site plan amendment passed the Planning Commission with conditions. Stormwater permit has to be issued by the City Engineering Department first. 10-inch concrete has to be installed anywhere the forklift operates. That's noted on their updated submission. Bike path has to be elevated near the wetlands pursuant to the original submission, but we wanted that specifically stated. Future community building and pool location to be removed, because there was some contemplation on the PUD to maybe in the future move that community building at Hartshorn to a waterfront location, but it's up in the air, so we didn't want to put it on the plan if we're not certain that that could take place. And then there was originally a gate that was contemplated for traffic control when there's boats moving in and out of there. We didn't want to impede public with a fixed gate for the trail or the road, so we asked that to be removed and to have active traffic management when there's a boat moving, so a person walking, spotting, and doing traffic control, which is generally how this is done in marine communities. Speaking of, so this is the equipment that's utilized. I think a lot of people, when they hear it, they think about those big travel lift wells that have four feet and move sailboats. This is actually a modified forklift, a specialized forklift that picks boats out of that boat vending machine building, and then with a spotter, you can see right there in the blue shirt, walks it over to the forklift drop, and then they put it in the water for the boat user. So just to reiterate, the current launch path where people are launching boats right now is in orange and comes from these existing buildings in this existing site. Those operations would move over here, and they would come across through the Hartshorn Marina to the existing forklift drops that were used by the Lumbertown development and utilize that methodology instead. So proposed new launch in blue and current launch in orange. So we get into reduction in trailer parking and increase in car parking. So this is one thing that's sort of confusing for the public to get a handle on, because this is actually in two different site plans because they were originally two different developments with two different owners. So there's a net reduction in trailer parking composed as of now with the two site plans. We go from 34 boat trailer parking spots over 2 parking areas to 21, still over 2 parking areas. However, we go from 7 park-oriented passenger car intended parking spots, which are directly across from the bathrooms in the small boat basin, to 83 total spots between 2 parking lots, one on the small boat basin peninsula, and then one which is a retooling of the existing parking lot right now. The existing parking lot has a large curved apron with a green space in the middle, which is intended for the trailers to drive around and loop, and is designed for them to keep from hitting folks. But the way it's redesigned, they won't go over there. So it's a drastic increase in car parking, and there is a decrease in trailer parking as well. And then the other big change I want to highlight that's proposed by these PUD site plans is there's currently a gravel drive that people utilize right now to go down and fish in the small boat basin, which the boaters didn't love when there was a basin there, but that was a constant complaint point. That gravel drive is currently parallel to the trail and the small boat basin and runs in between them. The proposed plan would convert this area to a public green space. So as of now, there's a barbed wire fence, chain link fence that Hartshorn Marina Park actually implemented, which was overgrown and separated the waterfront from that driveway. That would all be removed, and there would be a soft shoreline along with a transient dock that would be placed right there, which would all be publicly accessible. So that would go from driving space to green space. Now the potential drawback to that is some folks drive all the way down it so that they don't have far to walk to get to the area that they like to fish. So that is a changeover for that additional large amount of green picnic space. And soft shore space, we'd be giving up that ability for some folks. So impacts to the Lakeshore Trail, and I'm running a little over, but I want to make sure we get through this. This is important content for people to understand. Impacts to Lakeshore Trail. Hartshorn Village Trail would contemplate moving the Lakeshore Trail. Adelaide Pointe would contemplate moving the Lakeshore Trail. Then finally, I want to briefly discuss the railroad easement that the city is in the process of acquiring. So, as I mentioned, the original plan at Hartshorn moved the bike trail already. It moved it closer to the large boat basin and eliminated a driveway, which is now accessed over at the Fricano's parking lot to get into that marina. At the end of both of these projects, there will be a shared road between the two of them to the left of Fricano's that would actually access the marina. So that road was eliminated, which moved the bike path closer to the marina. The trail plan for the Hartshorn PUD amendment right now includes a bypass. It does not eliminate any further trail, but in purple here you can see that driveway next to that orange building is where people would be coming out with a fork truck to cross the boat, and they would have somebody actively managing any bike or pedestrian traffic or vehicle traffic in the driveway. But if people didn't want to wait, if I'm there with my kids in a stroller or if I'm on a bike and I don't want to wait, there's a plan calls for a bypass to go around the building and continue on my way. And then finally, as I mentioned, the conditions the Planning Commission approved in that amendment require raising the trail in the wetland area to stop the problem of flooding, per the original site description. That's actually a picture I took in April 2020. That is the bike path. That's a regulation road cone right there. And that's a swan that built a nest on the bike trail. So, and she was there all summer. She was hanging out, having a good time. So to avoid these types of issues and getting those folks access to that trail again, there's some changes that need to be made from an engineering standpoint. So Adelaide Pointe also contemplates moving the Lakeshore Trail. It would be relocated closer to the water along the Adelaide Pointe Marina. And I would encourage you in the site plan table to really take a close look at these. It's hard for me to convey it on these screens. So originally there was 4 crossings for pedestrians that were contemplated in this plan. That's been reduced at the request of staff and the Planning Commission to 2, just to make sure there's not multiple crossings when there's bikes and strollers and people coming through, when there's people trying to get to their boats from there. And so there'd be 2 crossings. It would move closer to the waterfront, and then the trail will also tie into new non-motorized pathway systems that would go down both peninsulas and then would eventually get out to that break wall. The trail would also give access to public areas of Adelaide Pointe's development, such as the plaza in front of the multi-use building. And then last but not least, we have the city railroad easement acquisition. So the city has been working for a couple of years now towards acquiring this former CSX line easement, which is just a dead railroad spur. It used to go all the way through to Sappi. It no longer does, and there's no use of it, so we're trying to acquire that. There are conditions to acquiring that easement. There can't be anything built on it or over it, and so what we would like to do is we would like to work with the Leastamas to put what we would call like a bypass for the lakefront side, and basically people would have 2 options, or it would also create a trail loop where if people wanted to like walk laps, they could actually stay in this entire area in the Hartshorn lower western area and do laps on this site and have a additional non-motorized path that would reconnect at Boys and Girls Club. So we just kind of walked through like, here's how this thing's going to impact what's there today. So what would the conditions look like in the event that these are completed as designed in their plans? So we're going to go over creation of new lake access for folks. So the small boat basin turns into a peninsula park. One thing that has been historically accurate is that this has been gated all the time to anybody who does not have a slip in that basin. So there was 31 slips, I believe. I'm looking at a couple people I know had slips in there, but I think there was 31 slips. And those were the people that could access that, them and their guests. There's a bathroom here that was keyed and locked, and if you weren't a marina user, you couldn't use that bathroom. So all that fencing and stuff would go away, and we would develop new park space, including a new public parking for the park, and then a picnic area, a walkway. There's some wetlands out here we don't want to bother, so we would do a boardwalk walkway and then some waterfront access at the end. And then at Adelaide Pointe, this site would host 2 peninsula parks. So there is an existing cooperative use agreement that's been passed between Adelaide Pointe and the City of Muskegon City Commission that allows for non-exclusive use of assets in the Hartshorn Marina's boat launch and forklift well area and small boat basin area in exchange for easements from the bike trail to the entirety of these basins. So these basins would also have new peninsular parks installed that would then, on the westernmost side, connect to the breakwall and fishing pier. I do want to make a note, that's not the most recent site plan. The marina is way smaller than that now, but I didn't have a rendering of that breakwall. So, speaking of, there would be a new public breakwall and fishing pier contemplated that the DNR has appropriated $1 million towards the fishing pier portion of that asset, and they're working towards Eagle permit for this marina that would include portions of this, which should be announced very soon. The city will hold irrevocable public access to this amenity with dedicated easements from the Lakeshore Trail. And then one thing that I want to make sure is on everybody's radar that is interested in public access and interested in our park system here in Muskegon. The public's been accessing this area for fishing for years, but it isn't necessarily designed for fishing and is not necessarily contemplated for those people. It's not thought of with them in mind when they come here. So there's several locations in the park that we think we can do a lot better with, where there'd be great ADA accessible fishing amenities that we could implement. Right now there's grassy areas that really don't serve a purpose. They could be landscaped and hardscaped and be zero barrier for people. And then you have, people that could still park close and have a complete zero grade barrier to get to fishing. There's also huge potential for the restroom remodel that's there. And then fish cleaning stations are not on site and other assets. If we're going to allow fishing, I think we have to have those assets. Historically, looking through our records, and we actually found photos where there's big signs everywhere in this marina that said no fishing allowed, but we haven't enforced that for years. So if we're going to contemplate allowing fishing in these areas that are not the basin areas where people's boats are, then we really have to be intentional about it. So I want to let everybody know, and I'll be out there with Dan Vanderheid, our Public Works Director. We're going to be undergoing a Parks and Recreation master plan process, and we'll need your help kind of contemplating like what you want to see in Hartshorn Marina Park and other parks throughout the city. So be looking on the lookout from notifications from the city for that. Specifically, I'm kind of talking about that area to the left of the boat launch. That's sort of this area where people walk out there and pitch a chair. You can actually see some of the degradation. It's worse now. But that could be a great area for some fishing location. So staff recommendations up till now and our next steps. So what we really tried to focus on in these plan contemplations is public return on private investment. So folks that have invested in these sites now, utilizing Brownfield TIF and having the city utilize Brownfield TIF for these public pieces of infrastructure, but they're also investing millions of dollars in cleaning these sites up and grading them and getting them buildable again. There's been all this deferred access over time. This puts a real strain on neighbors, businesses, and visitors because this area has been vacant and blighted and has invited dumping and other not great activities that we don't want to see in our neighborhoods. So we feel that we've worked with these private sector partners to kind of put together plans that improve and enhance public access. They improve corridors for the neighborhood people that live there in NIMS and other places to access the water. And I think when we make this public waterfront more attractive and more accessible, more people will enjoy that park than probably enjoy it today. So targeted investments in this new public infrastructure we think will actually lead to a greater quality of life overall. And the planning documents have gotten progressively better over the 2 to 3 to 4 years that we've been working with these partners to try to get this going. So again, we're using these tools at our disposal, but overall we think the developments and their interaction with Hartshorn Marina Park generate an ecosystem with more public access to Muskegon Lake. We think they'll allow additional pedestrian walkways, fishing space, parking, and connections from the NIMS neighborhood to the waterfront, where none currently exist. So before we break into the question area and the interaction with staff, I wanted to note this map illustrates areas that are public and accessible all the time. So full caveat, this is a public marina and it's open during business hours, but I think it closes the gate at 5 or 6. And then the small boat basin was never open if you didn't have a key card to open the gate. So they weren't really publicly accessible. And you had to rent that pavilion if I remember correctly. But so public road, public driveway, bike trail, and then the parking area for the park is kind of what exists today. This is what is contemplated to be publicly accessible. Obviously some of this is roadway and parking lot, but a lot of it is new walkways, new peninsula parks, new park trails. And then if we can get this railroad thing done, this black line right here would also be an additional trail asset. That's sort of what we would be going from and then going to at the fruition of the plan from a public access perspective based on the agreements that have been contemplated. So with that, there's that QR code again if you want to have electronic access to those documents. I ran a little over time, but thank you very much. It's a very dense presentation, and I'll see you guys at the interaction. Thank you.